8.
You're watching the Experience Comic Culture and Sales. Streaming live daily to Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter.
2, 1.
Hey everybody, how you doing? Happy Tuesday to you. Today we are going to talk about Jack the King Kirby, one of the most prolific comic book artists of all times, one of the major architects to what we now know as both the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the DC Universe, and just has had an incredible life. His birthday would have been yesterday. He would have been 106 years old, and I thought, well, you know what? Let's do a Jack Kirby show today. Now, some of you may have heard this story before, but I wanted to share it. When I first started reading comics when I was 5. First comic I ever got was Captain America. I think it's 189, done by Frank Robbins. And my uncle bought it for me. And from age 5 to, I want to say 8, 9 years old, I would just pick up comics when I could. And then my mother introduced me to a coworker she had who was big into comic books. The reason she knew him is because she worked at a Kmart. She was a manager. And when the new Star Wars toys came in, she'd be in the warehouse pulling the ones I want before they hit the floor. And she would have to hurry to get there before this guy Gil did, because he was a Star Wars fan too. And eventually that led to us meeting, and he started picking up comics for me at the local shop, which was 20 miles from here. Didn't have a local shop. Well, when I was 11, he told me about a convention in downtown LA, and he asked my mom if I could go with him. And this was awesome. This was my first comic convention. It was just, I was excited as hell. We drove to LA, underground parking, went into the Biltmore Hotel, went to the basement. There was an escalator, took us down to the basement. And one of the banquet rooms was turned into a comic convention. And it was a pretty small convention by comparison to the ones I see nowadays. It was, this would be the same size room that a good sized wedding would take over. There was this horseshoe-like setup for dealers with a middle section. So that was it. It was about, a decent section of maybe a dozen or more, almost 2 dozen retailers. And then there were tables set up for signings. And I got 3 signatures that day. Well, I got more than 3, but the 3 that stood out to me. I met Walter Koenig, got his signature, became a Star Trek fan after that. Met Carolyn Monroe, who had done Golden Voyage of Sinbad, was in the upcoming James Bond movie, became a James Bond fan. And I'm pretty sure that's what started me liking women, was meeting her and getting her signature. But the big one for me was meeting Jack Kirby. Kirby sat at a table, him and Roz, his wife, signing books. He had a decent size crowd. Maybe 10, 15 people in line. Didn't have to wait long. He was very, very nice when I got up there. Really enjoyed talking to him. I had a Captain America comic. He flipped open the front page, signed the inside the indices, or below the indices, saying, "To Daniel, Jack Kirby." I walked away from that table going, oh my God, this was awesome. This was the best thing ever. I needed more. I wanted more. So I ran into the dealer area and started looking for comics I could buy. And not having a lot of money, Gil told me, you should check out Black Panther. It's a recent thing he did. But you should be able to get it pretty cheap. So I started going through and I started finding all the issues. And I ended up having to borrow like $7 from Gil to get all 15 issues of Black Panther, because that's all they made. And then with my 15 issues, I turned around, headed back for the table, and Jack was gone. His signing was over. Crestfallen, I held my comics, not knowing what to do, and I get yelled at from across the room. Gil says, Dan, he just went up the escalator. I'm like, all right, I'm 11. I don't know there's things you do and you don't do. All I know is that I wanted these books signed and he was leaving. So I ran after him, caught him in the lobby of the hotel. He had just run into somebody, a woman who it seemed like they were old friends. That's the memory I have of it. And I stood there with the comics and she looked at me and went, Jack, and pointed at me. And Jack turned and goes, oh, you got a few more books for me to sign, do you? I said, yes, sir, if you would. And we walked over to this little table. It's like the white courtesy phone was sitting there. And I would take the comic out of they were all bagged and board because I bought them from boxes. And he would flip it open and he would sign it. And then it would put the bag and the board and the comic to the side. And his friend would then put them away. And we started this little conveyor line of him signing all of these books for me. And like I said, there was 15. Now, what I didn't realize is he had stopped working on Black Panther with number 13 or with number 12. But he still created the character. So Jack was happy to just keep signing. Signed all 15 books for me. And I ran back down and I found Gil. And I'm like, oh my God, he signed him. And that was such an influential moment on me that I came out of there wanting to know everything about the comic creators and wanting to be one myself. And basically after that, whenever I got a comic, I had a folder with lined paper in it, notebook paper. And I would draw a grid on there and I would put down the title of the book. It was Daredevil, and it was Daredevil number 145. And then I would put the title of the issue, Cat's Paw. And then I would put in the writer and the artist. Now, I didn't understand inking or lettering or any of that stuff, but the writer and the artist were important to me because those were the jobs Jack did on Black Panther. So in my head, I wanted to be a comic creator. And I would spend time after that writing and drawing my own comics and realizing I was never going to be a good enough artist to draw comics. I started focusing more and more on writing, and that was always my dream, to work in comics. So yeah, it's all because I got to meet Jack Kirby when I was 10 years old, 11 years old. Stay tuned for the Dan Wickline Show. Hey everybody, welcome to the Dan Wickline Show here on The Experience. It is Tuesday, August 29th. And today we're doing a Jack Kirby special. So we're going to do things a little differently. I'm glad you guys like the story. I got to tell it one time that meant a lot to me, telling the story. Because I was working with a group called CAPS, and you may have known them. It's the Comic Arts Professional Society. I was a member, And they do these events where they gave out this award. I think it's the Sergio Aragonés Award. And they were giving it to Stan Lee. And there was a little banquet dinner for him. And this wasn't a convention thing. This was a get together with a bunch of comic professionals giving an award to Stan. And I helped put the book together. And I got to go, and everybody was going up there and getting things signed from him. We all had a chance to approach him and talk to him for a minute. And you got to sit down with him, which was great. It's not where you're just leaning over the table. You actually got to sit and chat with him for a minute. He would sign books. So it was a little more than what would later happen. We're at signings where he would just sit there and you'd take a picture with him. This was much earlier than that. And when I went up there, and I had won something that night, a Spider-Man figure signed by Stan. So I didn't need a signature. I didn't have anything to sign anyway. But I went up there because I wanted to tell him the Jack story about how much Jack meant to me and how much Stan meant to me as well, that growing up and how much comics changed my life. And I told him the story about Jack. And I know that there's a lot of animosity towards Stan, a lot of negativity, and I don't care. No, Jack wasn't treated right. Jack deserved better, all of that. But as I told this story to Stan, I could see the look on his face and the look in his eye. And this wasn't a guy who was like, oh, great, another Jack story. Or, oh, can we just move this along? He was really listening. And as I told him the story, he started tearing up. And yes, I was able to get a picture of Stan and I together after I told the story. So that's my two treasured moments, one with Jack and one with Stan. I wish I would have been able to get a picture with Jack when I was a kid, but there weren't cell phones. You didn't carry a camera in your pocket. It just wasn't the thing. But I do have the book signed by Jack, and I have that Spider-Man toy signed by Stan. And those are going to be treasured items for me. All right, we're not going to do news today, mainly because I have a lot on Jack's history. If you know everything you know about Jack, cool. If not, I'm going to basically give you the guy's history because he's incredible. They just did a Stan Lee documentary. I think they should do a Jack one. There's been a few out there, but there could always be more. When Randy Bowen was the popular thing, doing all the little minibus, they put out a Stan Lee and a Jack Kirby. I still have those. Would love to have had a Steve Ditko one to go with that. So, yeah, Stan's an important guy in the industry, but I'm going to tell you just how much. All right. So let's get into it. Now, he was originally born Jacob Kurtzberg, and he would go on to use a lot of different aliases or pen names before ever settling on Jack Kirby. And while a lot of people think he did it to hide the fact that he was Jewish, he would argue with that. So, but it was a pretty common thing. Stan Lee is actually Stanley Lieber. So it was kind of a common thing to do in that era, to take pen names anyway. Whether it was to hide your heritage or not, you can decide. So Jack was born August 28, 1917, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in New York City. Now, he was raised there by his parents, Rose and Benjamin, who were Austrian Jew immigrants. And his father earned a living in the garment factory. And that was always what Jack feared, is that he would end up working in a factory like his father. He didn't want that. And Jack had this desire to escape his neighborhood. Now, he loved to draw, and he sought out places he could learn to be better at it, but he was essentially self-taught. He was rejected by the Educational Alliance because he drew too fast with charcoal. And according to Kirby, at age of 14, he had enrolled in the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. That's a very prestigious art school at the time. And he only stayed there a week. And he said, I wasn't the kind of student that Pratt was looking for. They wanted people who would work on something forever. I didn't want to work on a project forever. I intended to get things done. And you'll see that throughout his career, that he would do the amount of work in a day that a lot of artists took a week to do. Now, in 1936, he joined the Lincoln Newspaper Syndicate, where he would do comic strips and single panel advice cartoons. And he used the name Jack Curtis at the time. And he would use this one a lot, actually. He also started working for Fleischer Studios as what was known as an in-betweener. And this is an artist who fills in the action between the major movement frames. So the big artists would do the major scenes, and then Jack would draw the connecting page, how do we move him from here to here? Well, Jack did the little in-betweens, an in-betweener. Now, he would be working on Popeye cartoons, but he didn't stay there long. Jack said, I had to get out of there in a hurry because I couldn't take that kind of thing. It was like a factory in a sense, like my father's factory. They were manufacturing pictures. Now, around that time is when the American comic book industry started taking off. Kirby began writing and drawing for Eisner and Iger. Yes, it's Will Eisner. What they would do is they would package these comics. They would bring in artists and stuff. And they would produce these comics inside or in the studio, and then would license them out to different publishers depending on the demand. And Kirby did his first comic book work here. This included strips like the science fiction adventure, The Diary of Dr. Hayward, and here he would use the name Kurt Davis. He did the Western crime fight feature Wilton of the West as Fred Sand with an E at the end. He did a swashbuckling adventure based on the Count of Monte Cristo. And again, he would use Jack Curtis on this one. And he would do some humorous features, one called Abdul Jones, where he worked as Ted Gray, and then Sacco the Sea Dog, where he just worked as Teddy. All of these were done for Jumbo Comics. Now, he first used the name Kirby, or at least the surname, with the first name Lance. So he was Lance Kirby, and he did 2 Lone Rider Western stories in Fabulous Funnies number 63 and 64 back in 1939. Now, he would ultimately settle on the pen name Jack Kirby because it reminded him of actor James Cagney. And Kirby was, if you know him physically, Cagney is a pretty close role model for him. They're both smaller men, tough as nails, just little fire hydrants type of guys. And I think that's great that's who he was looking up to, was James Cagney. Now, Kirby would move on to Fox Feature Syndicate, and we've talked about them. We talked about them just recently in the Blue Beetle deep dive. Well, it turns out that Jack was part of the team that created the Blue Beetle. The Blue Beetle is credited to Charles Nicholas, but it was like 3 or 4 different people that worked under that name at Fleischer, Jack being one of them. And he worked on 3 different issues of the Blue Beetle, making what was at the time considered reasonable salary of $15 a week. Could you imagine drawing an entire comic book for $15 a week? Now, during that time, Kirby also met and began collaborating with another cartoonist at Fox, who was also one of the editors there, named Joe Simon. And Simon said, I love Jack's work, and the first time I saw it, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. he asked if we could do some freelance work together. I was delighted. And I took him over to my little office. We worked from the second issue of Blue Bolt through about 25 years. Now, they were hired as a team as they were hired on staff by a pulp magazine publisher, Timely Comics, published with Martin Goodman as the publisher. Now, Timely, of course, would become Atlas and then eventually Marvel Comics. There, Simon and Kirby created the patriotic superhero Captain America in the 1940s. Simon would be the head editor, and Jack would become the art director. And the first issue of Captain America, which was released in early 1941, sold out in days. And the second issue print run was set at over 1 million copies. The title's success established Simon and Kirby as a team, as kind of a notable creative force in the industry, similar to Siegel and Schuster. Basically, they kind of became the guys to work together. And after the first issue was published, Simon asked, I covered that. Now, the problem was that when they created Captain America, they had made a deal with Goodman for a promised 25% of profit. And Simon was pretty sure they weren't getting it. So they started doing this thing on the side. They started lining up a deal with National Comic Publications, who would later become DC Comics. And they negotiated a deal that would pay them a combined $500 a week, as opposed to about $75 or $85 they were earning at Timely. Now, the problem here was when they started making the negotiations, they were doing it in secret, but Goodman found out and basically kicked them off of Captain America after issue 10. One of the people working in the office at the time was an editorial assistant named Stan Lee. And Jack was certain that it was Stan who knew about them working the deal with National, and told Martin, because Stan was Martin Goodman's nephew. Well, Joe Simon didn't think that much of it, said it happens. Jack was pretty upset with Stan, and this would lead to an odd relationship between the two of them for pretty much ever. Now, when they went over to DC, or to National, Jack Leibowitz, he tried to find something for them to work on, but they got like ghost stories to do, stuff like that. And by ghost, I mean fill-in stories. But nothing was really clicking. So finally, Leibowitz just said, do what you want. So they picked the character Sandman, and they revamped him. Then they revamped Manhunter. In 1942, they started a book called Boy Commandos. And that was kind of their thing, these kid tales, comics. The ongoing Kid Gang series launched the same year, and basically it sold over 1 million copies a month. It became National's third best-selling title. And then they did another one called the Newsboy Legion, which appeared in the Star Spangled Comics. So they were really taking off. Now, while this was going on, things got interrupted by this little thing called World War II. Kirby was drafted into the U.S. Army on June 7th, 1943. He spent basic training at Camp Stewart near Savannah, Georgia. And then when he got out of basic training, he was assigned to Company F of the 11th Infantry Regiment. Now, he landed in Omaha Beach, and though Kirby says it was about 10 days after Normandy, it was more like 2.5 months according to history. Just saying. One of his lieutenants discovered that who Jack was, that he was this artist who did comic books. So while other artists and stuff would get assigned to the propaganda department, stuff like that, Jack was made a scout and was sent into the field ahead of the regiment to do recon and to draw maps and pictures so that they could then plot things out. This was one of the most dangerous jobs in the Army at the time. So, all right, we're going to take a break. We'll do our first commercial, and when we come back, we'll talk about what happened to Jack after the war. Be right back.
Did you know that every experience show, including some exclusive content, streams on Twitch? Check it out, twitch.tv/the_EXP. Or just scan that QR code. According to a statistic that I just made up, people spend 4 hours a day changing the television channel. People who watch The Experience don't do that. Save yourself a ton of time by tuning into The Experience and enjoying our new original programming 7 days a week. And then tell your friends. Think about the money they could save on batteries in the remote alone just by tuning into The Experience. Find out more by scanning the QR code below.
There's something for every imagination at your local comic shop. Visit comicshoplocator.com to find a store near you.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dan Wickline Show. Please hit the like and subscribe buttons, and we are going to continue our history of Jack Kirby. Excuse me. Drank wrong during the break. Well, after the war, Simon and Kirby reunited and ended up at Harvey Comics, and they had this thing where basically they would go to different companies and redo their success. You know, we had the Boy Commandos and the News Legion did great over here, so we're going to go over to Harvey and create Boy Explorer Comics and Western Boy Ranch. And we did good with superheroes, so we're going to create the Stuntman, and since 3D movies were becoming the thing, Captain 3D. But the biggest success of this time was something completely new for them. Simon had Simon was inspired by McFadden Publications' romantic confession magazine, True Story. So he took that idea and kind of translated it into comic books and he and Jack created something called Young Romance. So Young Romance #1 came out, and it quickly became a monthly title, and it was one of their biggest hits of all time. It also had a spin-off of Young Love, and together the two titles sold 2 million copies per month. Now at this point, Timely, now Atlas Comics, had relaunched Captain America, and he was a commie fighter because the Nazis were no more. And this really irked Simon and Kirby, because that was their creation. So they went and created a new character called the Fighting American. And Simon says, we thought we'd show them how to do Captain America. And originally the book was done straight. He was also going to be a commie fighter. And then the whole McCarthy hearing things blew up, and the whole attitude towards communists changed. So by issue 2, it became a satire of superhero comics. And it never really took off that much, even though Rob Liefeld would later try to bring the character back. So there's quite a few patriotic comic book characters out there. And a lot of them were based off of either the Shield or Captain America. And Kirby had more than his fair share of those. Now, in 1955, Simon had kind of decided he was done with comics, while Kirby wanted to continue. So they broke up the partnership, but very amicably, they were still friends. And Simon moved into freelance to advertising work, while Kirby would end up working both for National and Atlas. And, every time he would go to work for Timely, Atlas, Marvel, he would have to put the animosity he felt towards Stan Lee aside. But in this case, it wasn't for long, because Atlas only lasted about another year. And then they imploded. They went months without producing any new material. So for about a 30-month straight period, Kirby did work for National. And in that time, he produced 600 pages of art, which included work on Challengers of the Unknown, House of Mystery, and Green Arrow. And it was interesting because Green Arrow was always created as kind of a Batman pastiche, even though it was for the same company. They went, hey, this Batman guy is working out well. What if we did the exact same thing, but instead of a bat, he's inspired by Robin Hood? And when Jack took it over, he added this kind of a sci-fi touch to it, and now he was more of a spacefaring character and totally got away from the whole thing with the Batman style. But the problem was that the editors there weren't that thrilled with it. Mort Weisinger, who created Green Arrow, wasn't happy. There was a contract dispute going on between Jack and one of the editors on some side work. And the editors were all being hypercritical. I mean, getting down to pointing out that, oh, you didn't draw all the laces on this one character's combat boots. So Jack left. But luckily, Atlas was back up and running, and Kirby returned. But it was not a very good page rate. It was pretty low because the company was still struggling to get back on its feet. So Jack was having to do 4 or 5 pages a day and put in about 12 to 14 hours a day, which, we think about it now. We get an artist who can do 1 comic a month and we're happy. He was doing a comic a week. That's just insane. Plus, he was all over genre-wise. He was doing Western, crime, romance, war comics. But what was really starting to get people's attention was either the supernatural fantasy and the science fiction books he was doing. And this was really hitting it with the readers. They really loved his otherworldly designs and the powerful creatures he was creating. Now, he still took some side work at the time. He was hired with Joe Simon again to create a character for Archie that they called the Fly, who is still over with Archie now. But shortly after that, he would team up with Stan Lee to create the Fantastic Four. And the book was such a hit that it just kind of took up all of Kirby's times at that point, because he became the house style for Marvel. This is an era where they were just one hit after another. Oh, hey, Clayton. So, okay, we'll see you on the replay. So it was just one hit after another with the Hulk and the X-Men and Thor and Magneto and Doctor Doom and Ego, the Living Planet, the Inhumans, the Black Panther. By the way, I find this fascinating. The Black Panther was the first black superhero in comics. He was created in 1966, 3 years after the historic March on Washington. The March on Washington took place in 1963 on Jack Kirby's birthday. So the anniversary of the March on Washington also happens to be the birthday of the guy that created the first black superhero. Just thought that was interesting. Lee and Kirby gathered several of their newly created characters at that point, created the Avengers, and they would bring back some of the original characters like Submariner and the Captain America that Kirby had co-created. While this was an incredibly creative time, Kirby grew very dissatisfied with working at Marvel. He still had the resentment towards Stan Lee, but now it was because Lee was the media face of the company and getting a lot of credit for creating characters that Jack was, part of creating or created himself. There was a lot of promises made that were, not kept by Martin Goodman, and he wasn't really getting credit for plotting the stories that he would do, stuff like that. So eventually in 1970, Kirby was presented with a contract that included unfavorable terms with a prohibition against legal retaliation. Now, Kirby objected to this, and Marvel's management just went, "No, we're not negotiating. You can take that contract or leave." So he left. He went to rival DC Comics and went to work for Carmine Infantino. And he went there to create a series of interlinked comics. Now, the whole thing here was called The Fourth World, and included 3 new titles: New Gods, Mr. Miracle, and the Forever People, and one existing title, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen. Now, if you're wondering why he picked Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen of all the books to tie into this whole new thing, it was simply because at the time the book had no creative team, and Jack didn't want to put anybody out of work. Now, he created the central villain for the Fourth World, Darkseid, and some of the concepts, and they would all appear in Jimmy Olsen first to get a larger audience, and then launch the Fourth World books, trying to give it the best exposure they could. Now, Darkseid, by the way, is also Jim Starlin's inspiration for Thanos, so you can see how Kirby's influence spreads out. While at DC at the time, he also created OMAC, the One-Man Army Corps, Commandy, the Last Boy, and Etrigan the Demon. Well, again, Jack wasn't happy with how things turned out at DC. Ed says, have you ever seen the original concept art? Yeah, when it was going to be called the Cold Tiger. Yeah, they definitely changed it up, made it much better. There was specific reasons for the design, and I think it was a tribute to one of the flags or something. But yeah, what they ended up doing was much better. Now, in 1975, there was a comic book convention called MarvelCon, and they had a panel for the Fantastic Four. And Stan Lee used this to announce that Jack Kirby was coming back. And Kirby then came into the room, sat down, the two of them regaled the audience with stories. And this is pretty much why or how Kirby returned. And when he returned, he would write and draw the Captain America series, as well as the Captain America's Bicentennial Battles one-shot. He created the Eternals, which includes the Celestials, now a huge part of Marvel's history, and they're part of what made the Marvel history happen. He wrote and drew the Black Panther series, the one I got, as well as he did a lot of covers across the line. And at the same time, he worked on other things at Marvel, including Machine Man, Devil Dinosaur. And he had what was considered Marvel's first graphic novel, which was a collaboration between Stan Lee and Jack. This was their final comic collaboration for the Silver Surfer, The Ultimate Cosmic Experience, which came out in 1978 as part of Marvel's Fireside Book series. Now, he was still dissatisfied with Marvel's treatment of him, and Kirby left again, this time going into animation. He worked for Ruby Spears Productions on cartoons like Turbo Teen, Thundar the Barbarian, and he also got to work on the new Fantastic Four animated series that were written by Stan Lee. So they kind of worked together again, but just not in comics. He did an adaptation of The Black Hole for Walt Disney. This is a really interesting one. He was hired by Barry Geller to do layout designs and stuff for an adaptation of Roger Zelazny's Lord of Light. Now, this film never ended up happening, but famously, Kirby's drawings were then borrowed by the CIA and used to create this cover to help get Canadian embassy, or the U.S. embassy. That was Canadian, but they helped get people out of Tehran during the Iran hostage crisis by posing as a movie location scouting crew, and they used Jack Kirby's art as art designs that they were going to use for the movie. It was how they sold that it was the movie. So that's the movie Argo, if you ever want to see how that worked out. In the early 80s, Kirby would hook up with Pacific Comics, making one of the earliest industry deals for creator-owned series. This included Captain Victory and the Galactic Rangers and the 6-issue miniseries Silver Star. He would still do some periodic work for DC in the 80s, including a brief revival of the Fourth World Saga. He did the Superpowers miniseries and the graphic novel Hunger Dogs, which was kind of the wrap-up for Fourth World. He would team up with Gil Kane to help create and design the animated television series The Centurions. And then, of course, there was a DC Comics for that, and a toy line by Kenner. He did concept art for producer Charles Band for films called Dr. Mortalis and Mindmaster. These two would later be released as Dr. Mordred and Mandroid in 92 and 93. Now, Dr. Mordred originally had been an adaptation of Doctor Strange, but Charles Band's option on the property expired, so they had to make it something completely different. And then he worked for Topps, where he founded the Kirbyverse. And then he did the Phantom Force, which ended up being published at Image Comics as the last things published by Kirby. Now, he finally started getting some recognition in the later years. Kirby began receiving, the Main Street Press started recognizing his accomplishments. In '87, he was one of the inaugural inductees to the Will Eisner Comic Book Hall of Fame. In 2017, Kirby was posthumously named a Disney legend for his creations, not only in the field of publishing, but also because of the creation that formed the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He was married to Rosalind Goldstein in 1942. They had 4 children and remained married until his death from heart failure in 1994 at the age of 76. So that is the history of Jack Kirby. So we're going to take a quick break. We got some key collectibles from Kirby, and that'll be the show. So we'll be right back.
Comic Collectibles is a pretty straightforward show. You got Rex here, he sells the comics, and you got Rocket Robbie, he knows about the comics. And finally, John, well, no one really knows what John does. I mean, don't get me wrong, he's a great guy, but he just keeps showing up. come to think of it, I don't even really know how he gets in here. Anyway, awesome comics, rare books, rarer signatures, slabbed books, and amazing cover sketches by Ken Hazer and others. Simple formula: you want the comics, you buy the comics. To sum up, Rex sells the comics, Robbie knows the comics, and John, who might possibly be a ghost. I mean, seriously, has anyone ever seen him show up or leave? Comic Collectibles with Rex and John, Mondays from 6 to 8 Eastern on The Experience. Comic Culture and Sales.
You know how when you go to Comic-Con, after Comic-Con, you go to the hotel bar, and there's a whole bunch of people playing music and dancing, and you've got Pikachu and Lara Croft Tomb Raider doing the cha-cha slide just down from Deadpool and Batman and Wonder Woman? That's every Saturday night over on the Experience Twitch channel. Join Taji Beats for the EXP Dance Party, exclusively on Twitch, twitch.tv/the_EXP. Go follow The Experience on TikTok at @the_EXP1 or scan the QR code on the screen. Our TikTok is like everywhere else we are, except you only have to deal with us for a minute. Seems like a win-win to me.
Welcome back. Remember to stick around. We've got what do we call it? Minute to Skim It is coming up at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. Then we have Mint Hunter tonight as well, so you'll want to stick around for that. And let's go ahead and we're going to hit the key collectibles. Now I picked some old ass ones for Jack Kirby. I mean, some early days stuff. So we start with the first comic book he ever did. This was called The Romance of Money. He did it for Lincoln News, and it was given away in banks. And it wasn't standard comic size. It wasn't standard comic paper. But this is the first thing he did. It goes for about $2,800 if you can find a copy, $1,400 for medium condition, $400 for low end. This is Jumbo Comics, where we talked about he did a lot of stuff using different names, including Jack Curtis. This was his first professionally published interior artwork from 1938. This is also the issue that Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, debuted. So you get 2 for 1 here. First Jack Kirby art and first Sheena, Queen of the Jungle. $26,000 on the high end. Median is $9,000. $3,100 for the low end. Now, Marvel Mystery Comics. This had a cover by Jack Kirby. It's one of his early ones. Included a damsel in distress, which would become pretty normal in comics. $8,000 on the high end, $2,000 on the median, $800 on the low end. Blue Bolt. This was the book that he and Joe Simon started working on. This was the first official collaboration between the two from 1940. It's Blue Bolt number 2. Goes for $2,500 on the high end, $695 on the median, $230 on the low end. Red Raven number 1 from 1940. This was first Kirby work for Timely. This was before they became Marvel or Atlas. And the first appearance of Pluto, which was a character that Jack created that would later get retconned into being Crow of the Eternals. So there's some interesting trivia that not a lot of people know. This is a $22,000 comic, $6,000 on the median, $1,800 on the low end. We, of course, have Captain America number 1, first appearance of Captain America, Bucky, Red Skull. This is a $680,000 comic. Median's $160,000, low end is still $45,000. Simon and Kirby. Star Spangled Comics. This had the origin of the Star Spangled Kid in it. This was the Newsboy Legion that Simon and Kirby came up with. This goes for about $1,500 on the high end, $420 on the median, $140 on the low end. Young Romance #1. This was the one that created the genre. First romance comic published, $2,500 on the high end, $875 on the median, $250 on the low end. Then we have Justice Traps the Guilty, #58. Now the reason this one is here, this was part of Frederick Wortham's Seduction of the Innocent. This was used as an example of violence against the police. So this goes for about $240. Low median's about 75. Low end is 25. Then we have one of the more popular early Jack Kirby covers, Kid Colt Outlaw #107. This goes for about $340 on the high end, $70 on the median, $20 on the low end from 1962. And there you go. So we didn't get much into his Marvel stuff with those because we always do those. We always come across those. But these are some of his other work that he did in his early days before Fantastic Four, except for the last one. Or actually, it was right before the Fantastic Four. But really fun and interesting show today, Dan. I loved your stories, hearing about the King. You were very welcome. I enjoyed doing this. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to it. Triple B says this has been an awesome episode, Dan. Thank you very much. I am glad you guys were here. And I appreciate all of you. I really do. I appreciate you guys coming in and listening. And because you never know what I'm going to cover. I don't know what tomorrow is going to be. I know Thursday will be Ahsoka. Tomorrow could be anything. Yeah, just kind of all over the place. I'm thinking of doing one on Star Killer. If not, it would just be me listening to Dan. Yeah, without you guys, it would just be Jay going, yeah, I got that down here, Dan. I see all the books. Ahsoka drops at night, 9 p.m. Well, I'm assuming they're keeping the schedule. It dropped at 9 p.m. That may be a midnight drop. I don't know if they've changed the time, but it's supposed to be tonight, tomorrow type of thing. So I would look for it at 9 p.m. Eastern. And if not, it'll probably be midnight Eastern. But we'll talk about it on Thursday. But there's some people thinking that a video game character called Star Killer, and Star Killer was the original last name for Luke Skywalker before they changed it. He was going to be Luke Starkiller. Seemed a little too on the nose. So they created this character later on in a video game called Star Killer. We have a mysterious character in Ahsoka, and in the credits we see a reference to Sam Witwer, who plays Star Killer in the video game. So might do a deep dive on that. We shall see. But thank you all for joining us. Remember, come back for Minute to Skim It, starting at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. And I'll see you all tomorrow. Have a good night.
Join the party. Head over to our Linktree to find all the links for everywhere the experience is all the time.